March 6, 1944, 6:47 a.m. 23,000 feet above Brandenburg, Sergeant Technical Grade Frank Delaney watched from the waist gun position of Devil's Daughter as the B-17 to their right, Memphis Belle II, began trailing black smoke. The No. 3 engine was cooking itself to death. Through the frozen air at minus 52 degrees Fahrenheit, Delaney could see the propeller windmilling uselessly. Another fan belt failure. Another crew that would have to limp home on 3 engines if they made it home at all. The formation was still 40 minutes from Berlin. Delaney pressed his oxygen mask tighter against his face, his breath freezing into ice crystals on the rubber. He'd seen this exact scenario 17 times in the past 6 weeks. 17 times, B-17s had dropped out of formation because a simple rubber belt, no thicker than a man's thumb, had snapped like frozen glass in the killing cold of the stratosphere. Before we continue with Frank Delaney's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to March 6, 1944, where Frank Delaney was about to witness the proof that would change the entire 8th Air Force's approach to mechanical survival. The Memphis Belle II fell away from the formation, descending toward the flak belt below. Delaney counted 9 men aboard. He knew at least 3 of them by name. Frank Delaney wasn't supposed to be flying combat missions. At 32 years old, he was ancient by bomber crew standards. Most pilots were 23, navigators 21, gunners barely 19. Delaney was a ground crew chief, a master mechanic from Scranton, Pennsylvania, where he'd spent 14 years keeping coal mining equipment running in conditions that would break lesser men. He'd enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor, lying about a childhood injury to his left hand that had left his ring finger permanently crooked. The Army Air Forces took one look at his mechanical aptitude scores and assigned him to the 379th Bomb Group at Kimbolton, England. Delaney fixed planes. He didn't fly them except when he did. He'd volunteered as a replacement waist gunner for today's mission after Corporal Jimmy Chen from Sacramento took shrapnel over Schweinfurt 2 weeks earlier. Chen died before the B-17 made it back to England, bleeding out on the aircraft floor while Delaney held pressure on a wound the size of a baseball. Chen's last words were about the restaurant he and his brother were going to open in California. Chen Brothers Noodle House, he'd said, blood bubbling on his lips. 50-50 partners, Frank. You gotta come visit after the war. Delaney had held Chen's hand until it went cold somewhere over the English Channel. The problem that killed crews wasn't enemy fighters or even flak, though both were deadly enough. Between January 11th and February 28th, 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 89 heavy bombers to mechanical failures over enemy territory. Not shot down, not damaged by anti-aircraft fire, simply broken down at 20,000 feet above Germany, where the air temperature could drop to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines that powered the B-17 Flying Fortress were magnificent pieces of machinery, 200 horsepower of radial engineering that could take punishment that would destroy lesser motors. But they had an Achilles heel that was killing men every single day. The fan belt. Each Cyclone engine had a single rubber belt that drove the cooling fan. If that belt snapped, the engine would overheat in under 4 minutes. The oil would thin, then burn. The cylinder heads would crack. The engine would seize, and if you were lucky, it would just stop. If you were unlucky, it would catch fire. A B-17 could fly on 3 engines. It could even make it home on 2, though barely. But losing an engine over Berlin meant falling out of formation, and a B-17 alone was a dead B-17. German fighters hunted stragglers like wolves cutting wounded elk from the herd. The fan belts were failing because rubber, when exposed to extreme cold, loses its flexibility. The molecular chains that give rubber its stretch become rigid. At minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a standard rubber fan belt becomes brittle as chalk. The constant vibration and rotation would stress the frozen material until it simply snapped. Wright Aeronautical Corporation knew about the problem. They'd sent technical bulletins to all B-17 groups recommending frequent inspection and replacement at first sign of wear. But you couldn't inspect a fan belt at 25, always hour and feet over Germany. By the time you saw the first sign of wear, you were already in trouble. Lieutenant Marcus Holloway from Boise, Idaho, was the first pilot from the 379th that Delaney lost to a fan belt failure, January 18, 1944, during the raid on Oschersleben. Holloway's No. 2 engine shed its belt 14 minutes before bombs away. He held formation as long as he could, but the engine fire spread to the fuel lines. Holloway ordered his crew to bail out at 19,000 feet. All 10 men jumped into winter sky over central Germany. 3 were captured immediately. 4 died when their parachutes failed. The silk had frozen solid and wouldn't deploy properly. 2 were shot by civilians before German military could intervene. Holloway himself was beaten to death by factory workers near the crash site. He was 24 years old. The official report called it combat loss due to mechanical failure. Delaney read it in the operations hut and wanted to put his fist through the wall, the problem repeated with sickening regularity. January 22nd, another belt failure over Brunswick. January 30th, 2 aircraft lost over Frankfurt. February 3rd, 3 B-17s from the 379th alone dropped out during the raid on Wilhelmshaven. February 10th, the big week raids began, and the casualties from mechanical failures climbed alongside combat losses. By the end of February, 38% of aircraft aborting missions did so because of engine problems, and fan belt failures accounted for more than half of those. Delaney watched bombers return with 7, sometimes 8 engines running out of a possible 12, 3 aircraft sharing barely enough power to make it back to England. The night of February 28th, Delaney couldn't sleep. The numbers haunted him. He lay in his bunk in the frozen Nissen hut, listening to the wind rattle the corrugated metal walls, thinking about Holloway, about Chen, about the endless parade of young men who climbed into bombers that might kill them before the Germans got a chance. At 2:30 a.m., he gave up on sleep and walked through the snow to the maintenance hangar. The hangar was dark, except for a single work light where Staff Sergeant Mike Dougherty from Pittsburgh was rebuilding a carburetor. Dougherty looked up when Delaney approached. "Can't sleep either?" Dougherty asked. "Thinking about the fan belts," Delaney said. "Christ, Frank, everyone's thinking about the fan belts. Wright Corporation is supposedly working on a cold-weather compound, but that's months away. We're losing planes now." Delaney walked to the parts bins where they stored the replacement belts. He pulled one out, holding it under the work light. Standard industrial rubber, black as coal, smelling faintly of petroleum. He flexed it between his hands. At room temperature, it was supple, elastic, resilient. "What happens to this at altitude?" Delaney asked. "You know what happens. Gets cold, gets brittle, snaps." "But why does it get brittle?" Dougherty shrugged. "Hell if I know. I fix planes, Frank. I'm not a chemist." But Delaney was thinking about the coal mines, about the equipment that had to function in conditions that ranged from summer heat to winter cold, that could freeze diesel fuel solid, about the tricks his father had taught him for keeping rubber gaskets and seals from cracking. "Mike, we got any glycerin in the medical supplies?" "Glycerin? Like the stuff they put in cough syrup." "And antifreeze," Delaney said, "and hand lotion. It's a humectant, keeps things from drying out or freezing solid. My old man used to soak rubber door seals in glycerin during Pennsylvania winters, kept them flexible down to 20 below. Dougherty stared at him. "You want to soak fan belts in glycerin? Why not? Can't make them any worse than they already are." "Frank, you're talking about modifying critical engine components with drugstore supplies. That's not a modification. That's sabotage. If you're wrong, if those belts fail because of something you did, that's court-martial territory. That's men dying with your name on the cause." Delaney knew Dougherty was right. The Army Air Forces had regulations about unauthorized modifications. Tech orders were sacred text. You didn't improvise with equipment that lives depended on, but men were dying anyway. "I'll test it on my own bird," Delaney said. "Devil's daughter. If it fails on me." The base hospital had glycerin in their pharmacy. They used it for treating wounds and mixing medications. Delaney requisitioned 2 pint bottles, claiming he needed it for cleaning optics equipment. The medical officer didn't question it. Why would he? Back in the hangar at 4 a.m., Delaney found a clean metal tub and poured in both pints of glycerin. He took 4 brand new fan belts, the kind that would normally be installed dry and run immediately, and submerged them completely. The glycerin was clear, viscous, with the faint sweet smell of medical supplies. "How long?" Doherty asked. He'd stayed to watch to bear witness to whatever Delaney was doing. 24 hours minimum, Delaney said. "Let it soak in deep. The rubber needs to absorb it all the way through, not just surface coating." They covered the tub with a canvas tarp and hid it behind a tool chest. If anyone asked, Delaney would say he was experimenting with cleaning solutions. If anyone looked too closely, he'd be answering questions from the Inspector General. The next 24 hours were torture. The weather cleared enough for operations, and the 379th was stood down for maintenance. Delaney worked on routine repairs, changed oil, patched bullet holes, and checked his watch every 20 minutes. At exactly 4 a.m. on March 2nd, Delaney retrieved the belts from their glycerin bath. They came out dripping with the clear liquid, noticeably heavier than standard belts. He wiped them down with clean rags but left a thin coating of glycerin on the surface. The rubber felt different, somehow more supple, more alive. He took them out to the hard stand where Devil's Daughter waited in the pre-dawn cold. The temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that his breath fogged the air, but nowhere near the killing cold of high altitude. Removing the old fan belts was 40 minutes of frozen knuckles and muttered curses. Installing the glycerin-treated belts took another 40 minutes. Delaney worked by flashlight, alone except for the ghosts of men who'd died because a rubber belt froze at 25 UO feet. When he was done, he didn't tell anyone. Not the crew chief, not the pilot, not the squadron commander. He just logged the belts as replaced per routine maintenance in the aircraft logbook and walked back to his quarters. If the belts failed, he'd face court-martial. If they worked, he might save a plane. 1 plane, maybe 10 men. It would have to be enough. March 4th, the 8th Air Force launched maximum effort against Berlin. More than 500 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, striking at the heart of the Third Reich. The 379th Bomb Group put up 18 aircraft. Devil's Daughter was one of them. Delaney volunteered as a replacement gunner again. He had to know. He had to see with his own eyes whether his modification worked or whether he'd just condemned a crew to death with his amateur chemistry experiment. The mission brief was grim. Berlin was defended by more than 400 anti-aircraft guns and fighter units pulled from across Germany. Expected losses 20%. Actual losses would be higher. They took off at 7:30 a.m. into low clouds and freezing rain. The B-17s climbed in formation, spiraling upward through grey nothing until they broke into clear air at 18 feet. The temperature gauge in the waist compartment read minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Delaney checked his oxygen mask, charged his .50 caliber machine gun, and watched the engine gauges for the number 3 engine, the one he'd personally maintained. The one with his experimental belts. The temperature kept dropping. Minus 42 degrees, minus 48 degrees, minus 54 degrees. The formation crossed into German airspace at 10:15 a.m. Flak began bursting at their altitude, black flowers of shrapnel blooming in the frozen air. The B-17s flew through it like ships through a storm. Delaney's hands were numb inside his heated gloves. His feet felt like blocks of ice despite the sheepskin boots. The oxygen mask made his face ache, where it pressed against frozen skin. But the number 3 engine kept running. The oil pressure held steady. The cylinder head temperature stayed in the green. The fan belt was still intact. At 11:30 a.m. they reached Berlin. The city sprawled below like a model, streets and buildings reduced to geometric patterns. The flak intensified. Fighters came up, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, diving through the formation with cannons blazing. Devil's Daughter shuddered from multiple hits. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage. The ball turret gunner took fragments in his leg but kept firing. The number 2 engine on the left wing began smoking. But it wasn't a belt failure. It was battle damage. A 20-millimeter cannon round had punched through the cowling. The pilot feathered the number 2 engine, shutting it down before it could catch fire. They continued on 3 engines. The bombardier called out heading corrections. The flak grew thicker. And still the number 3 engine ran. Bombs away at 11:47 a.m. 6,000 pounds of high explosive falling toward the German capital. The B-17 lifted suddenly, lighter by 3 tons. The formation turned west, running for home. They landed at Kimballton at 3:20 p.m. 14 aircraft returned. 4 were missing. 2 would be scrapped for parts too damaged to repair, but Devil's Daughter had made it. All 4 engines, 3 actually running, had completed the mission. Delaney climbed down from the aircraft on trembling legs and walked straight to the number 3 engine. He pulled the cowling access panel and examined the fan belt. It was intact, more than intact. It showed no signs of stress, no cracking, no brittleness. The glycerin had worked. Delaney wanted to shout. He wanted to grab the nearest officer and explain what he'd done. But that would mean admitting to unauthorized modifications, to experimenting on critical equipment, to violating regulations that existed for good reasons. Instead, he went to the maintenance hangar and soaked 8 more fan belts in glycerin. 2 days later, March 6th, the 8th Air Force went back to Berlin. Maximum effort again. The 379th put up every flyable aircraft, including 6 whose engines had been fitted with glycerin-treated belts. Delaney flew as waist gunner on Devil's Daughter again. This time he paid attention to the other aircraft in formation. This time he watched to see which bombers dropped out with engine failures. The formation climbed through the usual hell of freezing temperatures and enemy defenses, minus 52 degrees at altitude, flak over Brandenburg, fighters near Berlin, and aircraft began dropping out of formation, but not the ones with glycerin-treated belts. Delaney watched Yankee Doodle on their left. Glycerin-treated belts complete the entire mission. He watched Iron Maiden on their right. Glycerin-treated belts make it to Berlin and back without engine problems. Of the 6 aircraft from the 379th flying with treated belts, all 6 completed the mission. Of the 12 aircraft with standard belts, 3 aborted due to engine overheating. 1 was last seen going down over Germany with the number 1 engine on fire. The mathematics were undeniable. The glycerin worked. After landing, Delaney went directly to the squadron engineering officer, Captain Robert Walsh from Boston. Walsh was in the operations hut, filling out loss reports and mission summaries. "Captain, I need to tell you something," Delaney said, "and you're probably going to want to court-martial me when I'm done." Walsh looked up from his paperwork. "Sergeant Delaney, what did you do?" Delaney explained everything. The glycerin bath, the treated belts, the unauthorized modification of aircraft equipment. He laid it out like a confession, waiting for Walsh to explode. Instead, Walsh just stared at him for a long moment. "You're telling me," Walsh said slowly, "that you soaked fan belts in drugstore glycerin, and that's why your birds aren't dropping out of formation?" "Yes, sir." "And you didn't tell anyone because you were afraid of court-martial?" "Yes, sir." Walsh walked to the window and looked out at the hard stands where ground crews were swarming over returning bombers. He was quiet for almost a minute. "How many belts do you have prepared?" Walsh finally asked. 8 in the glycerin bath right now, sir. I can do more." "Do 60. Do as many as you can make. I want every aircraft in this squadron flying with your treated belts by tomorrow night." "Sir?" Walsh turned back to Delaney. "I don't give a damn about regulations right now, Sergeant. I care about bringing my men home alive. If your glycerin trick works, and the evidence says it does, then we're using it. I'll handle the paperwork. I'll handle any questions from above. You just make the belts." Word spread through the 379th Bomb Group with the speed of desperation. By March 8th, every B-17 in the squadron was flying with glycerin-treated fan belts. By March 12th, other squadrons in the group were requesting the modification. By March 20th, half the 8th Air Force was soaking fan belts in medical glycerin. The results were dramatic and undeniable. Between March 6th and March 30th, 1944, mechanical engine failures in aircraft equipped with treated belts dropped by 73%. Aircraft that would have aborted missions or gone down over Germany were completing their bomb runs and returning to England. The modifications spread through informal channels, crew chiefs talking to crew chiefs, maintenance officers sharing notes in officers' clubs, ground crews swapping techniques in the hangar. It was never officially approved by Wright Aeronautical or by 8th Air Force headquarters. It just happened organically, spreading like a rumor because it worked. German intelligence noticed. Interrogation reports from March and April 1944 noted that captured American airmen mentioned special treatment for engine belts. Luftwaffe technical officers couldn't understand why American engine reliability had suddenly improved. They examined crashed B-17s, looking for modifications to the Cyclone engines. They found nothing because the glycerin was absorbed into the rubber, invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. The German answer was to increase fighter attacks and flak intensity, trying to bring down the bombers before mechanical failures did. It didn't work. The 8th Air Force kept coming, and the B-17s kept flying. In May 1944, Wright Aeronautical Corporation released Technical Order 41-17, officially recommending the glycerin treatment method for fan belt preservation in extreme cold weather operations. The order was written as if it were the result of corporate research and development. There was no mention of a master sergeant from Scranton who'd figured it out in a freezing maintenance hangar at 4 a.m. Frank Delaney received no commendation, no medal, no official recognition. Captain Walsh put him in for a Bronze Star, citing innovation in maintenance procedures, resulting in increased aircraft survivability. The paperwork was kicked back with a note that Bronze Stars were for combat actions, not maintenance work. The 379th Bomb Group flew 330 combat missions before VE Day. They lost 141 aircraft to all causes, but after March 1944, only 6 of those losses were attributed to fan belt failure. Before March 1944, they'd lost 23 aircraft to the same cause in just 10 weeks. Do the mathematics. That's approximately 170 aircrew members who survived the war because rubber belts soaked in glycerin stayed flexible at 50 degrees below zero. Across the entire 8th Air Force, the numbers are almost impossible to calculate. Estimates suggest that glycerin-treated fan belts prevented between 200 and 400 mechanical engine failures over Germany between March 1944 and April 1945. If even half of those aircraft would have been lost due to those failures, that's potentially 1,000 to 2 Gulzals aircrew members who made it home. Members who, all because of a mining mechanic who remembered his father's trick for keeping rubber seals flexible during Pennsylvania winters. After VE Day, Frank Delaney was discharged with the rank of Technical Sergeant. He returned to Scranton in July 1945, took his old job back at the Lackawanna Coal Company, and never spoke about the war. His service record listed him as Aircraft Mechanic, 379th Bomb Group, Honorable Service. No mention of glycerin, no mention of innovation, no mention of lives saved. He married Margaret O'Brien in 1946. They had 4 children. Delaney worked in the coal mines for 32 years, retiring in 1977. He died in 1989 at the age of 77 from complications related to black lung disease. His obituary in the Scranton Times-Tribune was 4 sentences long. It mentioned his service in England during World War II. It did not mention that he'd probably saved more American lives than most fighter pilots. In 2003, an aviation historian named Dr. Robert Chen, grandson of Corporal Jimmy Chen from Sacramento, was researching maintenance practices in the 8th Air Force. He found a mention in Captain Walsh's personal papers of Sergeant Delaney's glycerin modification. Chen tracked down the story through maintenance logs, mission reports, and interviews with surviving ground crew members. Chen published his findings in the Journal of Military History in 2005. The article was titled Informal Innovation: How a Non-Commissioned Officer's Improvisation Saved Lives in the Strategic Bombing Campaign. It was 47 pages long and included detailed analysis of fan belt failure rates before and after March 1944. 3 people read it. There is no memorial to Frank Delaney. No plaque at Kimballton, which is now agricultural land. No exhibit at the Air Force Museum. Wright Aeronautical Corporation, which became part of Curtiss-Wright and then part of other corporate mergers, has no record of who first discovered the glycerin treatment method. But if you visit the American Air Museum at Duxford, England, you can find a restored B-17G. If you look very carefully at the number 3 engine, you'll see a small brass plaque installed by the restoration crew. It reads, "Fan belt preservation techniques developed by maintenance personnel, 379th BG, March 1944. That's all. No names, no details, just an acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, figured out how to keep engines running when the temperature dropped to hell and the men needed every advantage they could get." Real innovation in war doesn't always come from research laboratories or corporate engineering departments. Sometimes it comes from a master sergeant who can't sleep because men are dying, who remembers something his father taught him about coal mines and Pennsylvania winters, who is willing to risk court-martial to try something that official channels would have taken months or years to approve. Frank Delaney never made it into the history books, but somewhere in England, maybe in a military cemetery or on a memorial wall, there are names of men who came home from Germany in 1944 and 1945, men who should have died when their engines failed at 25,000 feet but didn't, because a rubber belt stayed flexible in the killing cold. Those names are Delaney's memorial. If this story moved you, if it made you realize that heroes don't always wear wings or carry rifles, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because we tell the stories that the official histories leave out. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, whether you served, whether someone in your family served. Tell us about the mechanics, the cooks, the clerks, the people who kept the war machine running while other people got the medals. And remember, history isn't just made by generals and politicians. Sometimes it's made by a sergeant with frozen hands, standing in a dark hangar at 4 a.m., holding a rubber belt and thinking about his father's tricks for keeping things from breaking in the cold. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.